Hey everyone, tonight we're about to wander through the dim moonlit hallways of medieval castles, peek into the smoky glow of candlelit cottages, and if you're lucky, survive. A day in the worn shoes of someone desperately trying to meet the harsh impossible, beauty standards of a time that took extreme to a whole new level. Picture this. You wake up and your first thought is, I hope my skin looks just pale enough to make people whisper. She's either nobility or on the brink of death. The sunlight filters through a dusty window and you squint. Uh-oh. The paler your skin, the higher your social rank. But God help you if you catch even the tiniest hint of a tawny well, suddenly be mistaken for a peasant. Trudging through mud, think sunscreen's going to save you? Nope, medieval folks had their own very creative methods. Spoiler alert, you probably won't make it through the beauty routine. But at least you'll learn how to apply lead paste with shaky hands. Before we dive in, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe only if you actually enjoy the content though. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing where in the world you guys are tuning in from. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background noise. And let's ease into tonight's wild journey. Ready? Close your eyes. Picture the room fading away, and suddenly you're in a place much older, colder, quieter, where the one thing that stands out more than anything is the feeling that everyone is staring at your face, especially if it's not nearly translucent. You've probably noticed that in those old medieval portraits, everyone looks like they just heard the worst news. Well, that's because they were all chasing the elusive. It's perfect pale skin, and it was no easy feat. You wake at dawn, the rooster crows. Unless you're one of the lucky few who can afford to sleep past sunrise, you're already worrying about your skin. For nobles and anyone trying to pass for one, the goal was to look like you'd never stepped outside in your life. If you're tanned, you might as well confess that you've spent the afternoon digging in the dirt. Historians still debate whether this obsession was all about status, or if it was meant to signal spiritual purity. After all, the paler the nun, the more likely people thought she was heavenly devoted. But forget SPF 50. No, you're more likely mixing up a homemade concoction, because medieval sunscreen was a dangerous blend. Want to lighten your face? How about a little lead paste, vinegar, and a dusting of white flour? Yes, lead. In fact, the paler your skin, the more likely you were slowly poisoning yourself. The Venetian Cirrus, a favorite beauty cream, was basically lead mixed with vinegar, something today's doctors would call a recipe for disaster. But hey, fashion before health, right? Of course, not everyone could afford these risky luxuries. If you were a peasant, you got your pale skin by default, thanks to being malnourished and anemic. Congratulations, you've achieved the wasted look naturally. Still, if you wanted to take it further, there were tricks. You could go for chalk, flour, or the truly unsettling egg mask, which would leave your face feeling like week-old bread. And let's talk about veins. Visible veins, especially the blue ones, were a sign of beauty. To truly turn heads at the medieval court, you get carefully draw blue lines on your temples and hands to make your skin look even more fragile and refined. The sicker you looked, the more beautiful you were. It's a beauty ideal that's pretty much non-existent in today's world. Unless, of course, there's a new Victorian consumption chic trend I missed. We might not realize it, but the obsession with ghostly white skin has been around for centuries. The mainstream historical fact is that throughout much of medieval Europe, pale skin wasn't just a fashion choice. it was a status symbol. Nobles didn't work in the sun, peasants did. So, to be pale was a way of saying, I have servants for that. The whiter the skin, the further removed you were from physical labor and, by extension, poverty. But historians still debate whether this obsession was as strict as we imagine, or if there were times, in places where rosy cheeks and a little sun-kissed glow were seen as signs of health. But whatever the reason, it didn't stop people from going to extreme lengths. For the upper classes, every morning was a battle to achieve that perfect porcelain complexion. Picture Lady Elenina perched at her vanity, dabbing white lead on her face, holding her breath as a maid carefully draws blue lines on her delicate wrists. The goal was indeed to look alive. It was to look just shy of being an artfully preserved corpse. One wrong move, one too many hours in the sun, and suddenly your marriage prospects could plummet. And get this, some medieval folks took things so far, they'd actually bleed themselves. Yes, with leeches or knives, just to remove the redness from their cheeks and achieve that ultra-pale look. So, if you think your beauty routine is painful, remember, at least at Docent Tea involve a bucket of leeches and a lot of hope that you don tea pass out. But it wasn't just the nobility setting the bar. The church didn't exactly help either. Medieval sermons often compared pale skin to purity of soul, like a clean, untarnished vessel. The paler your skin, the less it had been touched by sin. Of course, these preachers probably never slathered on lead paste, but they sure loved a good metaphor. Historians still argue whether these religious attitudes directly influenced beauty rituals or whether they just happened to go in the same slightly alarming direction. There were exceptions, though. In some Mediterranean regions, a little sun on your cheeks wasn't scandalous. Some folk traditions even praised the rosy-cheeked country maiden. But try telling that to the board court ladies in Paris or London who spent entire afternoons locked in dimly lit rooms, avoiding even the faintest hint of a tan. The irony is they probably missed the sun almost as much as they missed a decent dental plan. Picture yourself walking through a medieval marketplace. Women are tucking themselves into the shade of wooden stalls, ducking out of sunlight like startled bats. Even the children are trained. Cover your face, their mothers hiss, as they dash across a muddy road. Clutching homemade sunshields, basically scraps of linen, or, in a pinch, their own hands. But there's a darker side to all of this. The pursuit of paleness came at a real cost. Lead poisoning wasn't uncommon. Symptoms included everything from skin rashes and stomach pain to tremors and eventually madness. The worst part? Many women had no idea that their beauty potions were slowly killing them. They only knew that their friends admired their skin till it turned gray and papery. The price of beauty was deadly. Ironically, today people pay for spray tans and golden highlighter. But centuries ago, women and men alike would do almost anything to look like they'd never seen the sun. You might spend hours concocting a face paste, risk your health, and ruin your bed linens. All to have someone mistake you for a member of the Walking Dead. But don't think men were off the hook. Noblemen also strove for that delicate, nearly translucent complexion, especially at court. There's too much color in their faces, and they might be mistaken for soldiers or worse laborers. Some even powdered their faces, just like the ladies, though. They'd never admit it in public. Historians still argue about how common these male beauty rituals were. But enough old recipes and letters suggest it was a fairly open secret. Back in your medieval bedroom, you stand in front of a mirror or, more likely, a polished piece of metal checking for any sign of redness. Did you scrub hard enough last night? Was the lead paste evenly applied? You sigh, hoping that tomorrow your veins will be even bluer, your skin a little paler, and your place at court a little more secure. Outside a rooster crows, and the sun begins to rise. But you'll spend the day dodging its rays because, after all, beauty is a full-time job. If only someone had invented sunglasses and SPF, you might have had a fighting chance. But as the day drifts on and you slip deeper into sleep, you realize the real medieval beauty secret was in tea in the lead, or the leeches, or the endless hours spent indoors. It was in convincing everyone else that your suffering was worth it, that the price you paid in pain, poison, or boredom made you a little more beautiful, a little more noble, and if you squint, maybe even a little more human. Still perched on your creaking stool in your candlelit room, peering into your little mirror, you fret about your pallor. But now your attention shifts higher to your hairline, because in medieval Europe, it was in tea enough to look like you had in tea seen the sun since you were 6. You had to look like you hadn't had a normal hairline either, the ideal. Forehead so grand, so high, it would make even a modern supermodel do a double take. The more forehead you showed, the better. Nobility, fashion, and even art began dictating that the perfect face had to have a vast gleaming expanse above the brows of 5 head, as we might snicker today. So what do? You pluck and pluck. If plucking doesn't work, you shave. And if you're feeling truly adventurous, you apply caustic concoctions to dissolve those stubborn baby hairs along your scalp. Forget threading your eyebrows. This is full-on landscaping. But it wasn't just women embracing this trend. You'd see high-born men too in their bed chambers, squinting by the firelight, tweezers in hand, wincing as they tug out hair after hair. Some even enlisted their maids to help, turning hair plucking into an after-dinner ritual. If you want to be beautiful, you must endure, right? There's even an old saying, beauty knows no pain. In medieval times, pain was more of a guarantee than a risk. In paintings from the 15th century, like those of the Regal Woodville, or even the Mona Lisa's show, impossibly high foreheads. Sometimes so smooth and broad, you wonder if the artist just got bored of drawing hair. It was a real trend, and artists didn't just make it up. They reflected the standards of the time. But here's the kicker. Medieval recipe books didn't just stop at plucking and shaving. Some recommended a mixture of walnut oil and vinegar as an ancient method to stop hair from growing back. Others suggested rubbing in burnt barley or even cat dung. Imagine waking up, deciding whether you'd rather have stubble or smell faintly of barnyard. Talk about a beauty routine with character. Just when you think you're finished, fashion moves again. If your eyebrows are too close to your hairline, you'll need to thin them too. Some women even went so far as to scrape the skin off, searching for every last trace of fuzz. The only thing more dangerous than failing to achieve the look was succeeding, because infections, irritation, and scars were common side effects. Medieval beauty products? They weren't exactly FDA approved. Historians still debate whether this forehead obsession came from royal courts in France or Italy, where new fashions spread quickly, or if it was more about distinguishing the civilized from the rustic. After all, if you have the time and money to devote to endless grooming, you're probably not busy churning butter. As you wander the castle halls, you notice other women, all with their hair tightly bound under hoods or veils, their foreheads gleaming and bare. Some look proud, some sheepish, some just tired. You realize, just like with skin tone, these standards create a kind of secret code. One glance, and you know who belongs and who doesn't. The irony? Some men joined in, especially those involved in court life or portraiture. There are records of knights, even clergy, smoothing their hairlines, eager to look intellectual. There's a joke. If you lived back then and had a particularly low hairline, you'd probably be the talk of the village, and not in a good way. Look at that fellow, someone might whisper at the market. His hair starts halfway down his face. Unthinkable. For every trend, though, there's a cost. Those caustic pastes and homebrew potions weren't gentle. Many women developed sores or permanent bald patches, and some found they could never grow hair again. You can almost imagine the awkward family dinners. "Mother, why is your forehead so red?" "Never you mind, darling. Just pass the leeches. Remember those lead-based lotions from earlier?" Now imagine combining them with an acidic hair remover and trying to smile gracefully at a banquet. The truth, no one probably looked as serene as their portraits suggested. Behind the scenes, beauty hurt hand. Let's not give all the credit to the wild beauty rituals. Even peasant women, who couldn't afford walnut oil or imported tweezers, sometimes got in on the action. Using sharpened sticks or even clamshells, they embraced their own version of medieval ingenuity. If it removed hair, it was good enough. Throughout history, debates about beauty standards have never really stopped. A question remains. Did these beauty ideals truly filter down to the countryside? Or did peasants secretly mock the wealthy for their absurd grooming habits? Folk stories from the past suggest that village women often poked fun at city dwellers, implying that only those with something to hide would go to such lengths to alter their appearances. Removing so much of their hair was seen as a sign of status. But perhaps it was just too much for those in the country to take seriously. Still, the pressure to conform remained. The more exposed your forehead, the more people would believe you were wise, noble, and, let's be real, slightly intimidating. It's hard not to wonder if you caught a glimpse of your own reflection in a medieval mirror. Would you have been able to pull off the high forehead trend? For a final, odd touch, some beauty experts at the time recommended wearing a band across the hairline overnight to train the hair to stay back. When you woke up, you'd find a crease on your forehead if you were unlucky, even less hair than before. Fashion truly met futility here, didn't it? But it wasn't just about faces. The entire idea of beauty was constantly shifting. One year, it was all about showing off your high brow. The next, who knows? Trends move fast, and you might find yourself wondering as you settle into sleep with your freshly plucked forehead. If all this effort was just another way to make a clear division between the rich and the poor, the beautiful and the common. Imagine if only Instagram existed back then. How many tutorials would there be for perfecting that high forehead look? Would there be a weekly trend dedicated to it? Alas, no. The only thing that remained was the sound of the castle going quiet as you lay there. A little too self-conscious, wondering if it was all worth it. But here's the kicker long. Shiny, flawless hair was the real badge of beauty, and not the kind that just grew out of your head. No. This was hair that looked like a silky banner waving in the breeze, framing your perfectly high brow. For women especially, hair was more than just a feature, it was an asset. It was a currency, something you guarded and even weaponized at times. Your hair had to be healthy, thick, and well-maintained, no matter the cost. But medieval life wasn't exactly kind to your tresses. Stress, malnutrition, and yes, questionable hygiene practices made keeping that gorgeous mane intact a serious challenge. If you were lucky, you'd have access to sweet-smelling herbs like rosemary or lavender, which you could boil and strain into a fragrant rinse. If not, well, Basic soap was your go-to, and it did more harm than good. A good hair day was so rare that it was celebrated in the streets. Interestingly enough, hair pieces weren't just for the rich. Women of all social statuses relied on padded rolls or hair extensions, sometimes made from goat or horse hair, or get this seven human hair scavenged from combs. Ever worried about your extensions showing at a party? Imagine someone catching a whiff of your new braid that smells faintly of horse. And as if things couldn't get crazier, women also tried to dye their hair using walnut husk for chestnut brown or saffron for a hint of gold. The results? Predictable. But the effort? Monumental. Now, here's where it gets even weirder. If your hair wasn't long enough for the intricate styles of the time, you could fake it. Women saved their shed hair and used it to pad out buns and rolls, even going as far as to make their hair look fuller with hair cushions. The more elaborate your hairstyle, the more status you broadcasted. Ow. It wasn't just women who had hair anxieties, though men had their own issues too. Knights used to wear their hair long, symbolic of strength, while others preferred the neatness of a bob or shaved crown. But if you were a noblewoman, the stakes were higher. Your hair could be a deciding factor in marriage negotiations. A noble family might even refuse to attend a social gathering because of a hair mishap, like a lopsided braid. There's a debate on whether these beauty standards were truly oppressive, or if they offered an opportunity for self-expression. Some women trying to outdo each other for a place in the court's favor, or were they simply weary of the constant upkeep? And let's not forget hygiene. Combs made of bone or wood were precious, sometimes passed down through generations. Lice were common, so combing your hair daily became as much of a ritual as it was a necessity. If the lice infestation got bad enough, you'd have no choice but to shave your head and start fresh, though. Of course, you'd cover that up with a veil or hood if you were noble. Bad hair days took on a whole new meaning when they lasted for weeks. As for the hairstyles, you'd see everything from tight buns to flowing curls. If you had enough money, you hired someone to manage your hair. If not, you got creative, sometimes involving mud or even spit to keep your hair in place. That's right, hair gel made of earth and a prayer. Modern beauty influencers eat your heart out. In the end, these beauty standards were anything but practical, but they sure were a spectacle. You could almost imagine medieval women huddled in dimly lit chambers, staring at their reflections and wondering what the next fashion trend would be. Beauty in the Middle Ages wasn't just about looking good. It was about status, struggle, and a whole lot of weird beauty routines that would make today's trends seem almost tame in comparison. Ever heard of hair of the dog? No, I'm not talking about a hangover remedy. In medieval times, it might have literally meant tying stray dog hairs into your braid for volume. Yes, you read that right, dog hair. But don't worry, it never quite caught on with the dogs themselves. Now here's a fun one. Some women, to show off the length and health of their hair, only let it down in private or on special occasions. In fact, it was considered so alluring that only unmarried young women could reveal their hair in church. Married women, they kept it hidden at all times. Imagine how scandalous it would have been to let your hair down in public. Back then, it was quite literally letting your hair down. Of course, this whole beauty thing wasn't a solo effort. Whether you were at a village festival or a royal banquet, the competition was fierce. Who's got the shiniest, longest hair? Who's using the latest hair tonic? Who's got the most intricate twists this season? If you thought beauty standards today were exhausting, try doing it with lice, lead, and zero Instagram filters. Now, the big debate among historians is whether these hair standards reached all levels of society. Some say yes, pointing to folk traditions and village tales. Others argue It was all about practicality. Women tied their hair back for work and only styled it for special occasions like church or festivals. But what's clear is that for those who could afford it, or those who were determined to climb the social ladder, hair care was a full-time, complex, and sometimes downright ridiculous job. As you finally fall asleep, hair a tangled mess but heart feeling a little lighter, you can't help but feel some solidarity with those medieval women. After all, across the centuries, the tools and styles change, but the desire to be admired, seen, and sometimes just to fit in, well, that's timeless. You reach up, pat your own hair, and make a promise. No more horsehair extensions tonight. At least not tonight. Then, you wake again and realize your face and hair are on the only things up for judgment. Oh no. In the candlelit world of the Middle Ages, your entire silhouette was scrutinized, especially your waistline. You might think corsets are a later invention, but nope. Medieval folk already had plenty of tricks up their sleeves to squeeze themselves into the ideal shape, and none of them were comfortable. Art and poetry from the era praised slender waists, gentle curves, and an almost fragile, delicate figure for women. Never mind that most peasants had bodies built by years of hard labor. Nobility, though, they were expected to look soft, willowy, and ethereal, not strong, not muscular, but just fragile enough that you'd worry they'd blow away in a stiff breeze. By the 13th and 14th centuries, tight-fitting gowns became all the rage among the upper class. These gowns were tailored close to the body, laced tightly at the sides or back, and meant to highlight a narrow waist. If you were a noble woman, your maid might spend half an hour each morning pulling those laces tight and making sure your bodice was perfectly smooth. But here's the kicker. Before whalebone corsets, women stuffed their clothes with reeds, flax fibers, or even moss to shape their figure. Yes, moss. Some women even wore padded rolls around their hips to exaggerate the difference between their waist and hips, creating that sought-after hourglass look. And here's a fun fact. If your dress was uncomfortable, poking you in all the wrong places, or making you walk funny, chances are it was in fashion. You'd suck in your stomach, have your maid cinch those laces tighter, and pray you didn't faint during mass. No room for a hearty breakfast here. Many ladies skipped meals just to maintain the illusion. If you passed out, people might say you had a delicate constitution. But the truth was probably you just hadn't eaten and couldn't breathe. Some historians argue that these extreme waist-shaping trends were only for the high-fashion courts of France, Burgundy, or Italy. But as soon as you got close to nobility, the pressure was on. You know those images in illuminated manuscripts of women with impossibly slim torsos? Yeah, that wasn't all artistic license. Some women went to extreme lengths to appear slim, layering laces, slouching, or even training themselves to move with books on their heads to trick the eye. But let's pause for a quick joke. Ever tried running in a tightly laced dress? Don't? Unless you want to trip over your feet, rip a seam, and become the talk of the castle? Lady Marjorie fell again. Should have loosened her laces. The obsession didn't stop at waists. Flat stomachs, small busts, and narrow shoulders were also in vogue. Some women even wore tight undergarments, linen bands that squeezed everything down and in. You know, the youthful and pure look, if you can call that comfortable. Then there's the belt, slung low on the hips, studded with gems or intricate metalwork. It wasn't just an accessory, it was a status symbol. So the fancier the belt, the more important people assumed you were. Of course, men weren't exempt. While bulk was a sign of wealth, young men, especially the fashionable ones, were expected to look athletic, not too muscular, just noble. The real goal, looking like you belonged in court, not sweaty, not sunburned, just ready to dance at a moment's notice. And let's not forget the whole idea of body shaping. There's an open debate about whether people used corsets and padding regularly, or if they just made do with what they had. Some historians argue that a lot of the slim waists we see in art were just idealized representations. After all, no one really looked like that, but everyone pretended. For those in the middle of the social pyramid, though, the pressure was real. Young women preparing for marriage, hopeful men aiming for court positions, all of them compared, watched, and sometimes suffered. There is even a story of one duchess who supposedly had extra ribs removed to get a wasp waist. Historians say it's probably just a myth, but it shows just how far people were willing to go for the perfect shape. And speaking of illusion, here's another quirky tidbit. Some people painted shadowy lines on their skin or undergarments to fake a slimmer figure. Early contouring. Anyone? Imagine powdering your body to shade in a fake six-pack or sharper collarbones. The commitment was real. In Dante, even get me started on the miracle waters and slimming potions peddled by traveling quacks. Some were harmless, but others? Mercury and arsenic were involved. As for a smaller waist, some people were willing to risk their lives. Not everyone went along with it, though. Some women, especially in rural areas, rejected the tight-laced look. They tied their belts loosely and embraced their working bodies. But for those who stuck with the laces and rolls, there were some perks. Attention, better marriage prospects, and a sense of belonging to the in-crowd. But it was exhausting. By the time evening rolled around, as you finally unlaced your gown, you'd sigh with relief and rub those red marks from your ribs. But then you'd remember tomorrow's the May Day festival, and everyone will be watching. So you'd wake early, struggle into your dress, and try not to faint during Mass. Beauty may be pain, but in the Middle Ages, it was a full-time job. And don't even get me started on those shoes. That's right. The medieval beauty ideal for feet was something else. The smaller and more delicate, the better. Forget comfort. If your toes aren't tingling with pain, you're doing it wrong. Now, noble women didn't wear practical boots or sturdy sandals. Oh no, their prized possession. A pair of pullaine shoes with tips so long and narrow, walking in them was a calculated risk. And you thought heels were bad today? You're standing in a dim, medieval hallway. Candlelight flickers against stone walls, and at the end of the corridor, someone's shoes are impossibly long. They curl upward like the tail of a curious cat. The toes stretch 6, 8, sometimes even 12 inches past the foot itself, stiffened with bits of whalebone or wired stays. These aren't just shoes, they're a statement. The longer the tip, the higher your status, till someone, a king or a priest, inevitably calls them scandalous and demands a ban. In the courts of Paris, in the markets of Prague, long-toed shoes called pullaines became both fashion and battleground. For a while in the 14th and 15th centuries, everyone wanted them. Everyone, that is, with status to show. The rich stretched their shoes until lawmakers snapped. Some towns even made rules. A shoemaker couldn't sell points longer than a certain length. If you were a commoner and your toes went too far, you might be fined. Or worse. Stopped in the street, your shoe snipped by a constable with shears, while the townspeople laughed. It wasn't just a haircut, it was a public trimming of pride. For women, there was another challenge. Streets were muddy, often filthy, so they wore pattens. Wooden platforms strapped beneath their shoes to elevate themselves above the mess. Useful till you slipped. Some platforms raised women several inches into the air, so walking meant wobbling. Cities echoed with the rhythmic clatter of wood on cobble, punctuated by the occasional yelp and splash as someone lost balance and tumbled into the mud. But as always, people found ways to cheat. Some stuffed the toes of their shoes with wool to keep their feet from sliding forward. Others filled them with sand or even pebbles for weight. There are quiet little stories of jesters sabotaging a rival's shoes, slipping stones into the tips, just to watch them hobble awkwardly across the great hall, pretending everything was fine. And beneath all of that, the patterns, the pullaines, the pride, was one silent truth. It wasn't just about the shoes, it was about your feet. Small, Narrow, arched feet were the ideal. If your feet were wide, long, or rough, you hid them. Some women wrapped their toes tightly at night, trying to reshape them. There's no proof that medieval Europe practiced full foot binding, but the pressure was there. Subtle, whispered, passed from mother to daughter. Be dainty, be graceful, even when it hurts. Of course, most people didn't wear such elaborate shoes. If you worked in a field or a shop, you needed to move, you needed stability. But for feast days, festivals, weddings, the pointier, the better. Some chroniclers suggest that nobles measured their worth in inches of trailing leather. The longer the toe, the more impressive the man. Which brings us to the comedy of it all. Imagine trying to run in poulaines. Not a dash, not even a jog. Just an awkward forward tilt with a high probability of tripping. Maybe they held races for fun. Last man standing wins the feast. Everyone else just hopes to keep their dignity in their shoes. And yes, even the elite struggled. Shoes caught on stairs, snagged on carpets, twisted ankles during a dance. Some nobles, by the end of the night, could barely wait to kick off their finery and sit barefoot by the fire. Relief at last. Even socks were a signal. Wealthy men wore bright, skin-tight hose, often lined with fur, padded or dyed in deep colors. Then came the codpiece, a bold little flap over the groin that turned into a fashion war of its own. It wasn't just about feet anymore. It was about everything. In cities like London or Florence, some young men spent whole wages on imported Italian leather shoes just to impress at a feast. The poorer folks, they borrowed styles for special days, saved up for one good pair of shoes a year, maybe two. But not all shoes were dangerous. In the countryside, people preferred comfort. Soft boots, sandals, or simply bare feet in summer. There's even an old folk saying, barefoot in summer, rich in spirit. A gentle jab at those two, obsessed with appearance, to walk freely. And just as clothes could signal your family, region, or class, shoes did the same. In some towns, political allegiance was literally worn on the feet. One shape for your guild, another for your lord. A pointed toe might mean you supported the duke. Around one, the rebels. There is a lovely little legend about cobblers who stitched charms into the soles of shoes. For love, for luck, for protection. Some hid messages, prayers, even coins. Children played games, sliding their pattens across slick halls like makeshift skates. Sometimes the world of uncomfortable fashion paused for a little joy. But every night, someone, a tired merchant, a footsore noblewoman, a boy who wore borrowed shoes for the first time, sat by the fire and rubbed their aching feet, wondering, was it worth it? And the next day, they put them back on, because the world watched. And beauty, however strange, however painful, was always just a few more inches away. Now rest easy. Your feet safe beneath soft covers. Let's drift off, perhaps dreaming of a world where shoes told stories. And toes, however long or stubby, still carried the weight of pride, politics, and pageantry. The candle flickers low. You lean into the mirror, or what counts for a mirror in this century. A polished bit of bronze, reflecting your face in a slightly warped golden blur. Your brow, it's still there? Not quite, not really. Just a whisper of a line. A ghost hovering above an empty expanse of forehead. That, oddly enough, means you're doing something right. You're fashionable. In the courts of 15th century Europe, beauty is measured by subtraction. First your hairline, snudged further and further back. And now your eyebrows, plucked until they barely exist at all. The higher the brow, the closer to heaven. The thinner the line, the more refined the soul, or so they say. You see it in paintings. Noble ladies, queens even, with foreheads that seem to stretch on forever. Smooth, blank, pristine, framed only by the faintest trace of an arch. That, some poets even make jokes about it, comparing women's brows to clouds. It's barely there. Almost imagined, but not every region agrees. In Italy and parts of Spain, things take a turn for the dramatic. Some women, bold or simply bored, take to painting their brows in dark pigments. Lamp black, burnt almonds, tiny bits of charcoal stolen from last night's hearth. A new brow is drawn, not subtle, not apologetic, but sharp, peaked, mischievous. The kind of brow that looks like it just overheard something scandalous and is very much enjoying it. Even men dabble, especially for portraits or public events. A shaded brow could soften a frown, intensify a gaze, or just match your hat. And it's not just plucking. Oh no. There are recipes written down in delicate script on pages that smell faintly of rosemary and mildew, promising gentler ways to thin the brow. Honey, vinegar, the juice of green walnuts. Some suggest rubbing pumice stone across the skin. Beauty as abrasion. You might lose a few hairs and a little dignity, but the look is everything. There's debate, of course. There always is. Some scholars say this obsession with the forehead had deep meaning, that bare skin symbolized purity, intellect, a clear mind. Others say it was just fashion. Royals started doing it. Everyone else followed. And if you weren't wealthy enough to hire someone to groom your brows for you, well, you just hoped no one looked too closely. But as always, trends shift. By the time the wind changes, thicker arched brows are creeping back into style, especially among the more practical. Women working in fields, living in villages, chasing chickens rather than trends. A good strong brow kept sweat out of your eyes and didn't catch fire near candles, or even stories, soft ones like whispered lullabies, of young men falling in love with farm girls who had dark, honest brows, not painted, not plucked, just there. Still, the comedy of all this grooming was real. One noblewoman writes, rather tragically, that she lost her favorite eyebrow while plucking too close to a flame. The candle got it before the tweezers did. Another joke makes the rounds. Why did Lady Cecily wear her veil so low? She shaved her brows back too far and forgot where to stop. At court, the brow became a kind of ritual. A young bride-to-be might spend hours preparing hers, plucking, painting, reciting a charm or two, salt tossed over the shoulder. A murmur of Latin, because somewhere someone said a lucky brow made a lucky marriage. There's even an old ballad. It goes, a brow too sharp, a tongue too keen, brings sorrow fast and love unseen. If you didn't like your natural brows, you could always borrow a better pair. Recipes survive. Powders tinted with soot, or berries, or ashes. Fat to bind it. Some of the results were dazzling. Others ran in the rain, melted in the summer heat, faded. Halfway through a dance. Still, for a brief moment, you'd have arches, like a queen. Now, the scholars argue again. Did the common folk care? Did peasant girls pluck their brows before festivals, staring into puddles and hoping for symmetry? Or did they just shake their heads and laugh at noble vanities? Some folk tales suggest the latter. Stories poking fun at ladies with no eyebrows and nowhere to put them. The kind of humor passed down through quiet giggles and muddy shoes. But in other places, something unexpected happens. The unibrow becomes desirable. Across parts of the Mediterranean, a single, unbroken brow line signals intelligence and allure. Girls without one smear charcoal across their foreheads to fake it. Somewhere in a sun-drenched courtyard, a girl draws a line across her face and hopes it makes her look wiser, or at least more mysterious. Even in colder northern places, there are legends. The girl with the joined brow, the one who sings at harvest festivals, the one who marries well. And of course, there are rebels. Women who refuse to pluck, who walk into court with brows as bold as their opinions. Some shave designs, some dye them to match their gowns. Each brow becomes a tiny rebellion, a quiet declaration of no, not this time. In the end, it's more than hair, it's identity. power, pain, conformity, choice. Some say shaping your brows was a form of agency, the only control a woman might have in a world ruled by men and monarchs. Others argue it was just another expectation, another hoop to leap through, or pluck through. But always, the game begins again. Tomorrow, it might be a new recipe, a different arch, a slightly better pigment, or maybe you'll just wear a hood and skip it altogether. You close your eyes, temples sore, wondering if perhaps, just maybe, you'll let your brows do what they want next week, but not tonight. Tonight you've done enough. As you drift deeper, the ache in your brows fades into a soft hum, but the pressure never quite leaves. 'Cause even in the quietest corners of the medieval world, someone is always watching your face. There's a quiet argument, still echoing across the centuries. Did all these skin rituals really work? Or did they just make people a little more anxious, a little more creative, and maybe just a little more itchy? Some historians say beauty routines in the medieval world weren't just about appearances. They were bonding moments. Women sharing recipes, frustrations, laughter, mixing crushed herbs by candlelight while swapping whispered gossip about neighbors and noble women. Others see something heavier, another burden. It's an impossible standard laid at the feet of those with the least power, a daily battle against blemishes and bad luck in a world that often judged you by your cheekbones before your character. And for peasants, the goal was much simpler. Stay clean enough to keep illness away. Act, but don't waste what little you have. A splash of water, a wipe of cloth. That was the routine. Nothing fancy, just survival. If you worked in the sun, your skin told your story. Browned by the fields, lined by the wind. Honest, open, strong. A quiet rebellion against the pale, powdered faces at court. In fact, some rural traditions celebrated sun-kissed cheeks, a sign of good health and hard work. A woman with flushed skin and sturdy hands might be more desirable than one hiding behind veils and chalk dust. And yes, even in the village, there were ideas about skincare. Remember the crocodile dung facial? Well, not every peasant had access to Mediterranean reptiles, but they had their own tricks. Mud from sacred springs. Rainwater caught on the first night of the full moon. A rinse of dew collected quietly before dawn. Some of these folk cures worked, some didn't, and some earned you teasing at the tavern. She smells like marsh water, must be chasing a husband. They'd chuckle over ale and boiled turnips. But the routines kept going. Morning masks, midday touch-ups, nightly prayers for clear skin, all while the shadow of plague or pox loomed just outside the door. A glowing complexion wasn't just beauty, it was hope. Way to feel safe in a world full of danger.
And through all of it, one quiet truth emerges.
People have always chased impossible beauty standards. Sometimes gently, sometimes painfully, sometimes knowingly. The candle burns lower now. You run a finger across your own skin. It's just a little soap, a little water. Nothing poisonous. You smile, grateful. Somewhere long ago, a girl stirred a pot of vinegar and herbs and whispered the same wish you whisper now. Please let my skin be kind to me tomorrow. And as sleep begins to pull at your limbs, you dream of a world where beauty doesn't sting quite so much. But skin was only the beginning. Because in medieval life, beauty wasn't just about what you were born with. It was about what you wore. Every morning you stepped into your identity through wool, silk, laces, and law. And yes, fashion in the Middle Ages wasn't just about taste. It was a battleground. Enter sumptuary laws. It's mainstream historical fact. From the 13th century onward, across much of Europe, kings and councils wrote laws telling people what they could wear and what they absolutely could not. The idea, protect the social order. If a merchant's daughter wore velvet, someone might mistake her for nobility. A peasant boy showed up in scarlet, the world might tilt sideways. So the rulers stepped in. Only nobles may wear ermine. Scarlet is for lords. No gold trim for anyone under baron. The rules changed constantly, town to town, decade to decade. In Florence, velvet was for the rich, and even then, only in very specific doses. In England, certain furs were reserved for knights. If you broke the rules, you might be fined, shamed, or forced to give up your favorite outfit in front of everyone. But here's the twist. It rarely worked. Sumptuary laws, despite their seriousness, often backfired in the most delightful ways. People got creative. If you couldn't wear fur, you lined your cloak with it, hiding the richness just out of sight. If gold embroidery was banned, you used yellow silk instead, winking at anyone clever enough to notice. Tailors became quiet revolutionaries. Housewives stitched secret symbols into cuffs and seams. The law was slow, fashion was fast, and that made it fun. Now picture yourself before a medieval wardrobe. If you're wealthy, your fingers hover over deep indigo, a dye more valuable than some jewels. You choose a gown with a high neckline and trailing sleeves. Every thread is a statement. If you're poor, your choices are quieter. Browns, greens, dull yellows, sturdy, functional, still. That one ribbon, that tiny bead, it might turn heads at market, and even that could be dangerous. Historians still debate how seriously these rules were enforced. Some peasants were fined for wearing colors that glittered too brightly. Others bribed officials to look the other way. Fashion wasn't just vanity, it was strategy and beauty. It had a shape. For women, long sleeves, cinched waists, layers upon layers. To move was to glide, slowly, carefully. A stumble could unravel an hour's worth of pins and laces. Men had their own codes. Sharp doublet, tight hose, a cloak that draped just so. In Burgundy, towering cone-shaped hennons marked elite women. In Venice, platform shoes so tall, you needed help just to get across the room. Joke break. What's worse than tripping over your poulaines? Getting wedged in a church doorway because your hennin scraped the ceiling. Yes, fashion had hazards. Jewels were signals. Sapphire might mean noble birth or risky ambition. Brooches and pins did double duty. Decor and declaration. Even hats spoke. A flat cap. Married. A pointed hood. Not from here. A colored ribbon. Loyal to Lord so-and-so. One quirky detail, there were even laws about underwear. In some Italian cities, officials checked what people wore underneath. That shift or hose you thought was safe. If it was too fine, too lacy, you might be in trouble. Some records mention inspectors at weddings, actual underwear police. Why? Because clothes weren't just fabric, they were order. If a servant girl dressed like a duchess, how would anyone know their place? But the joke, as always, was on the rule makers. Ban one trend, and 3 more would rise in its place. Tailors invented new trims, new loopholes. Whole guilds specialized in walking the edge of legality. Fashion raced ahead while the law panted behind. Open scholarly debate. Did sumptuary laws truly preserve class boundaries? Or did they just annoy everyone equally? Some historians say they failed entirely. A bureaucratic headache. Others believe they shaped culture in subtle ways, reinforcing who could stand where and wear what. In the villages, it was simpler. A bright patch of embroidery, a scrap of silk, a red ribbon for a feast day. It meant something. Maybe not wealth, but pride, craft, hope. Children stitched lucky charms into sleeves. Grandmothers passed down a single piece of luxury cloth for wedding dresses. Even the poorest found ways to shine. But beauty was never risk-free. A well-dressed farm girl might catch the wrong kind of attention, or face accusations of pretending to be more than she was. In a world obsessed with hierarchy, even beauty had consequences. Another quirky tale. Sumptuary laws created underground fashion markets. Black market silks, forbidden dyes smuggled in sacks of grain, a garment stitched in secret, worn only behind closed doors, till a festival or a dare, outlaws in velvet, rebels in lace. A fashion-forward living one hem ahead of the law, and still, the laws came, and still, the clothes changed. A noble woman fined for her excess might show up next feast in sackcloth, but the feast after that? Silk so dazzling it dared anyone to stop her. And yes, the Lord with a train so long it required 2 pages just to carry it. He wasn't just making a fashion statement, he was saying, look what I can get away with. Peasant for a day, or donning outrageous costumes just to scandalize the hall and remind everyone that beauty, like power, was sometimes best handled with a sense of humor. You're still warm beneath your blanket, drifting deeper into sleep. And now your thoughts float through candlelit halls where beauty isn't just admired, it's wielded. Because at court, your face, your dress, even the way you walked, could be a tool, a trap, or a ticket to influence, a mainstream historical fact. Royal beauty wasn't always about personal preference. It was political, strategic, often orchestrated down to the curl. Every braid meant something. Every jewel had a message. A pearl hairpin might whisper purity. A ruby brooch, power, blue eyes, whether real or painted, suggested heavenly favor. And pale skin, always pale, was still the eternal currency of nobility. Here's a quirky detail. Some queens, worried about keeping their glow, refused to walk outside in daylight. Others traveled with silk parasols the size of wagon wheels, or smeared their faces with thick pastes of vinegar and lead, blocking both the sun and, unfortunately, their pores. A few even went further. Queen Joanna of Castile reportedly slept upright to avoid pillow creases. It's not because she feared wrinkles, but because her ladies-in-waiting did. And their job was to copy her exactly. Which brings us to the quiet absurdity of it all. Court life was a mirror house. Everyone watching everyone, a cascade of imitation and anxiety. A single freckle covered in one royal portrait might mean 100 women hiding theirs before next mass. And yet there was power in it too. Queen could set a tone that crossed borders. A new fabric in her wardrobe might launch a trade route. One new headdress might birth an entire style movement across a continent. Sleepy joke time. Why did Lady Cecily wear 12 rings on one hand? Because if the Queen blinked twice at your thumb, it might be next season's obsession. You smile at the silliness, but beneath it, the truth hums. Royal beauty, for all its glamour, was exhausting and fragile. One plague, one scar, one bad year, and the mirror cracked. Still the rituals continued. 1,000 candles lit, a dozen servants summoned, creams applied, gowns adjusted, all for a single entrance down a staircase or one glance across the hall from a future suitor. And for those watching from afar, the villagers, the merchants, the craftsmen, it was magic. A living fairy tale, laced with powder, stitched in gold, and always just out of reach. Open scholarly debate. Did this royal obsession uplift the masses, giving them something to aspire to? Or did it deepen the rift, reinforcing that some faces were born to be adored and others to disappear? The truth, like most things in history, is somewhere in between. Because even the cobbler's daughter might someday braid her hair like the queen. Even the baker's wife might sew her shift with blue thread just to feel a little closer to the dream. You sigh, your body sinking into rest, thinking of all the faces lost to time. Some painted, some forgotten. All of them caught, willingly or not, in the strange spinning dance of beauty and power. And as your dreams swirl into the soft velvet of night, you find yourself whispering a quiet wish for all those women long ago, that they knew. Even for a moment they were already enough. But history moves forward, and in the next breath, the scene shifts again. You're no longer in the court's golden halls. Now you're in a small cottage. The fire's low, the shutters closed. The world outside is muddy and cold. But inside, a mother is brushing her daughter's hair with fingers calloused from work. There's no silk, no rouge, just oil and herbs and a story. A story about a queen with a blue dress, a feast where the sky itself seemed to shimmer. And though they'll never be there, never wear what she wore or walk those floors, the image lingers, because even the most distant beauty leaves ripples. And even in the quietest corners of the medieval world, someone is always watching, always wondering, always dreaming. ... Folk made do with a wash basin, a cloth, and whatever water they could heat over the hearth. If you were lucky, maybe once a week you'd scrub your hands, face and feet. A full-body bath, that was festival behavior. But even in a world where water was suspicious and soap was scarce, people still cared deeply about how they smelled. And so they turned to scent. Quirky tidbit. In noble houses, herbs like lavender, sage, and rosemary were strewn across the floor. With every step, you crushed them, releasing fragrance underfoot, masking the less pleasant realities of medieval life. Unwashed tunics, livestock in the yard, and the ever-lingering aroma of boiled cabbage. Open scholarly debate. Did these herbs actually make life smell better, or just different? Some historians argue these perfume floors were practical. Early air fresheners, insect repellents, and disease deterrents, all in one. Others see it as medieval virtue signaling, a way for nobles to literally walk above the stench of the lower classes, and the perfume itself, not just for show. Medieval scent was medicine. Smell was seen as spiritual, emotional, even diagnostic. A foul odor might mean you were sinful. Sweet-smelling body at death, sign of sainthood. You stir slightly, imagining yourself swaying through a moonlit corridor. The air thick with rose and clove, your sleeves brushed with dried marjoram and frankincense. You smell of hope. You smell of status. You smell, above all, like you're trying. The poor had their own methods. If you couldn't afford perfume, you could burn dried herbs and walk through the smoke. You could boil mint and rub it on your underarms. You could tie a sprig of basil to your belt or tuck dried citrus peel in your bodice. Yes, practical joke break. Why did Brother Gerald carry a pouch of thyme around his neck? Because Sister Margaret said he stank of sin, and he wanted to smell forgiven. Back in the courts and noble feasts, perfume became ritual. Queens had favorite blends. Courtiers hired apothecaries to mix signature scents.
Ow.
Some women wore scented gloves or dabbed perfume onto their veils, so every hair toss was a fragrant declaration. But this, too, came with risk. Not all perfumes were safe. Some were made with animal musk, others with tinctures soaked in alcohol, resin, or even arsenic-laced fixatives. A little could entice, a little too much might give you a rash, or a fainting spell. Still, the desire to smell like heaven never waned. Another quirky detail, some lovers exchanged perfumed letters, scraps of parchment anointed with rose oil or clove. Tucked into bodices or kept under pillows, tiny scented messages from afar. And in certain monasteries, fragrant gardens were cultivated not just for medicine, but for joy. Places where scent was seen as divine. Lavender for peace. Myrrh for reflection. Jasmine to lift the spirit. You sigh in your sleep, lost now in that quiet garden. The petals rustle. The breeze carries rosemary and orange blossom. Somewhere a fountain bubbles gently. Do you remember? In the Middle Ages, the nose knew everything. It knew if you were clean, if you were ill, if you were holy, if you were rich, if you were in love. Mainstream historical fact. Even during plague outbreaks, people carried scented handkerchiefs or pomanders, hollow balls filled with herbs to ward off disease and disguise the smell of decay. They believed scent was protection, that good smells could defend against invisible evils. You hold your breath for a moment, half asleep, as though testing the air. Tonight, the world is quiet. It's just you and the scent of sleep. Cotton, breath, maybe a hint of lavender on your pillow. You whisper a silent thanks that your soap doesn't contain bear fat or ash, that your perfume wasn't brewed in a lead pot, that no priest is sniffing you to measure your virtue. And yet, you also feel something else. A thread, connecting you to all those faces who once pressed herbs to their skin, who stood in doorways hoping the wind would carry their scent just right. Because in the end, medieval beauty wasn't just about how you looked, or even how you smelled. It was about the impression you left behind in footsteps, in glances, in a single fading wisp of scent trailing behind you in the hall. Saints who were beautiful and punished for it, you're still drifting now. The flicker of candlelight behind your eyelids as the next part of the tale unfolds. Mainstream historical fact. Some of the most famous saints in medieval legend were praised for their divine beauty and tested for it. Take Saint Agnes, whose loveliness drew countless suitors, but who insisted her beauty belonged only to God. When she refused marriage, her admirers turned to violence and accusation. Or Saint Wilgefortis, who prayed to be made unattractive to escape an unwanted wedding, and according to legend, miraculously grew a beard. Stories like these weren't just spiritual parables. They were lessons. Beauty, especially for women, was seen as both gift and trial, something to protect, to resist, to fear. To own beauty was to be in constant danger, not only of pride, but of being desired too much, punished for the very thing you never asked for. Quirky tidbit. In some hagiographies, religious biographies of saints, female saints were said to become more beautiful after their martyrdom. Their wounds glowed, as their bodies didn't decay. Their hair grew like gold. Even in death, their beauty was a kind of divine reward, or proof of their sanctity. You shift slightly in your sleep, trying to imagine that. A face burned by fire, bloodied by persecution, and yet more radiant than ever. Open scholarly debate. Was this insistence on saintly beauty a way to sanctify women's appearance, or just another impossible standard cloaked in holiness? Some historians believe it offered women an elevated role, giving them a kind of power through purity. Others argue it simply replaced worldly beauty ideals with spiritual ones, just as rigid, just as unreachable. The church's tension with beauty wasn't only about women. Men were expected to appear humble, modest, and if they were handsome, not too aware of it. Monks shaved their heads in a tonsure, a ritual of humility. Priests were warned against scented oils or elaborate robes, yet bishops often wore jeweled rings and silken vestments, a reminder that even holiness had a dress code. In cathedrals, the stained glass saints gleamed in heavenly perfection. In pulpits, fire and brimstone preachers warned that pride goeth before the fall. You take a deep breath now, caught between these flickering images, the glowing virgin, the scolded girl, adjusting her veil in a mirror. And somewhere in that tension, you begin to see the heart of medieval beauty. A face wasn't just a face. It was a mirror of the soul, a battleground between vanity and virtue, a test, a message, a hope. Joke break. Why did Sister Cecilia stop wearing rosewater? Because every time she entered the chapel, the monks thought a miracle was happening. And yet, even within the rules and restrictions, people found ways to seek and celebrate beauty. Some pilgrims brought back holy water from shrines, said to cure blemishes. Some nuns wrote poems comparing the soul to a garden, tended daily, growing more lovely the closer it reached to God. And for every sermon that warned against vanity, there was a mother brushing her daughter's hair by firelight, whispering, "God made you beautiful, child. Let the world see." Mainstream historical fact. The lines between sacred and secular were rarely clean. In some regions, church festivals became opportunities to display not just piety, but pageantry. Girls wore their best ribbons. Boys slicked their hair. Statues of the Virgin were crowned with fresh flowers, adorned with silk and lace. The divine and the decorative forever intertwined. As you nestled deeper into your blanket, you realized the medieval pursuit of beauty, whether in a saint's glow or a scented glove, was always more than skin deep. It was spiritual, social, sometimes political, always personal. Tonight you rest your head, not just on a pillow, but on centuries of stories, of faith and freckles, powder and prayer, lipstick and liturgy. And in the quiet, just before sleep takes you, you wonder, would they have called you beautiful? Would it have mattered? Was the real beauty then as now? The quiet courage to carry your own face through a world that demanded so much from it. You drift off, the church bells tolling softly in the distance, whispering not of judgment, but of peace. And so, as you lie there beneath your covers, drifting somewhere between wakefulness and dream, your mind wanders through painted chapels and stone libraries. You trace the glow of stained glass saints and fairy tale maidens with your breath, not your eyes. Because even in art, beauty in the Middle Ages was never simple. You find yourself now in the echoing hush of a cathedral, where saints gleam like gold, suspended in halos and legend. But outside, in the margins of an old manuscript or the whispered lull of a fireside tale, beauty takes stranger shapes. The fair ones in these stories, whether angels, witches, or queens, come with conditions: a mirror that speaks, slipper that fits, a lock of hair that turns to flame. You realize slowly that beauty here is rarely a reward. More often, it's a riddle. Mainstream historical fact: throughout the Middle Ages, artists and poets used beauty to explore virtue, temptation, and fate. Paintings often portrayed idealized bodies, not just for admiration, but as moral symbols. A smooth face suggested a pure soul. A scarred cheek might mark a sinner or a martyr. The body became a map for meaning, traced by both faith and fear. And in this world, beauty could be fleeting, or eternal. Quirky tidbit: there are tales of bodies so beautiful in death they refused to decay, saints whose corpses smelled of roses, martyrs whose blood sparkled like rubies. These were signs, miracles, proof that divine beauty could transcend time and rot and ruin. But for everyone else, aging was the slow unraveling of divine favor. So the quest continued. In herbs and ointments, prayers and charms, in fairy tales and fasting, 1,000 tiny rituals to hold on to something already slipping through one's fingers. Open scholarly debate. Did these stories serve to soothe or to control? Did they help people accept the realities of their lives by offering fantasies? Or did they reinforce ideals no one could truly reach? Some scholars argue that tales were a form of cultural pressure, shaping behavior and desires. Others see them as hopeful acts of imagination, quiet rebellions wrapped in poetry and legend. You don't have to choose, you just listen. Let the voices of medieval mothers and maidens, monks and minstrels swirl around you like candle smoke. They didn't agree either. Joke break. Why didn't the medieval artist ever finish his portrait of the princess? Every time he added color to her cheeks, the monks accused him of vanity. You smile softly. It's a gentle kind of humor, the kind meant not to wake you, but to settle you deeper. And as the fairy tale castle fades behind the clouds of your dream, you sense the truth these stories whispered all along, that beauty in the end was not about perfection. It was about transformation. A milkmaid becomes a queen. A sinner becomes a saint. A scar becomes a symbol. A bedtime story becomes a kind of prayer. You breathe in, faint notes of lavender, parchment, smoke, and out. And somewhere beyond time and tide, a medieval world dreams with you. The margins of illuminated manuscripts, those glowing books of prayer and poetry, were often alive with jokes. Little grotesques, exaggerated noses, tiny animals with cheeky grins, a wink from the monk with the brush, a silent chuckle in the candlelight. We know this isn't real, they seem to say. Let's have a little fun with the edges. But the figures at the center, saints, nobles, mythical lovers, remained untouched. Serenely, impossibly beautiful, spared from scars, beauty in art was idealized, not observed. Even portraits of real people were softened by the artist's brush. A little more glow, a little less truth. Flaws smoothed over with a single stroke, face gently revised to fit a dream. And these ideals weren't confined to royalty or cathedrals. The oral tradition carried them far beyond palace walls. Songs, riddles, traveling tales, all helped spread the same standards. A Welsh lullaby described a child as bright as the Rowan moon. A Czech proverb claimed, "A girl without freckles is like a night without stars." Sometimes beauty was praised for its variety. Other times it was squeezed into a single fantastical mold. Open scholarly debate. Did these stories liberate or confine? Were they sweet daydreams whispered in the dark, or sharp little rules dressed up as rhymes? Some folklorists believe the most lasting stories are the ones where beauty turns out to be a trick, where the clever, the kind, the overlooked triumph. Think of Beauty and the Beast, Cinderella, the Loathly Lady, stories where love, mercy, or patience reveals the true loveliness beneath the surface. For anyone who felt too plain, too wild, too brown or scarred, these tales might sting. But they also offered a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the girl with the crooked teeth could whisper, "A fairy godmother might find me too." And sometimes, beauty was its own soft magic, a forbidden kiss, dance under a new moon, a secret wish carried quietly in the chest. Quirky tidbit. In some villages, it was believed that if you wanted to become beautiful, you should sleep with a book of fairy tales under your pillow, or failing that, with a mirror wrapped in red ribbon. No one knew if it worked, but it made for sweeter dreams. And as you drift toward morning, fairy tales swirl in the quiet dark, a shimmer of golden hair, a flash of silver eyes, a kiss that turns a frog into a prince. And you understand finally the quiet promise these stories carried. If only you could be beautiful, everything might change. That was the power. Not in their cruelty, but in their suggestion. That transformation was possible. That longing wasn't foolish. That magic could still find you. You've wandered through castles and cathedrals, trudged the muddy roads of far-off villages, stared into polished mirrors, into the faces of saints and sinners alike. And now, as this medieval night winds to a close, you find yourself among the ordinary people, the bakers and the weavers, the shepherds, smiths, and maids, the ones who faced impossible standards and still found ways to live, to cope, to compromise, or to simply breathe easy in their own imperfect skin. You imagine yourself now as one of them. Your hands are calloused. Your hair won't shine like the ladies in the ballads. Your teeth might be crooked. Your feet broad from field work. Your gown is rough spun. Your face sun-touched. Your brow a little furrowed. You've heard 100 stories about queens with golden hair, saints who glowed in death, but your world smells of onions, wood smoke, and bread. But that's enough. Mainstream historical fact. For most medieval people, survival came first. Beauty, when it mattered at all, was homemade. A bit of lard for dry skin, a splash of water at dawn, comb of horn, a braid tied with ribbon for the spring fair. In the countryside, sun-browned skin and strong arms were proof of a good life, of honest work, of being needed. Sometimes even quietly admired, if not in poetry, then in glances. Still, the echoes of impossible standards made their way to every cottage. The bride whose hair was too dark, the boy with the scar, the widow who watched her beauty fade with the seasons. Some tried to chase the ideal, a dab of flour on the cheeks, a rinse of rosemary, a blue thread in the braid to call on fairy luck. Others laughed, shook their heads. let the softness of the city roll off their backs like dust. Quirky tidbit. In some villages, women would hide their prettiest features, braiding long hair up tight beneath a cap, or smudging their faces before market day to avoid a lord's eye. Some painted beauty marks in secret places, so the fairies would know them, even if the neighbors did not. Open scholarly debate. How deeply did these beauty standards affect the villagers? Did they feel the same pressure, or did they simply ignore what they could never attain? Some records speak of sorrow, young women lamenting their freckles, mothers worrying over pale daughters. Others tell of quiet rebellion, painted teeth, soot masks, and songs mocking courtly fools. Some found new beauty rituals, May-Day crowns, old dresses stitched with flair, sweet herbs kept hidden for Sunday baths. Some accepted what they had, let the fancy powders stay with the rich, let the saints and queens be lovely on their own. But even among resignation there was comfort. In laughter, in music, in shared meals, and firelit jokes. Joke break. Why did the baker's daughter dust her face with flour before the festival? She figured if it didn't make her beautiful, at least she'd smell like fresh bread. And honestly, who could resist that? Because the truth is, ordinary people often saw beauty in places the artists forgot. A crooked grin, a lopsided nose, the way sunlight caught a single lock of hair. Mothers praised their children's freckles. Lovers kissed calloused hands. Elders remembered the brave girl with the gap-toothed smile, the kind boy with the crooked ear, and in rare moments, even the impossible seemed possible. A village boy crowned king of fools, a scarred woman asked to lead the feast, a silver-haired widow teaching children to make flower crowns. For beauty, yes, but mostly for joy. Open scholarly debate. Did these little rebellions, these scraps of magic and mirth, ever truly challenge the weight of impossible standards? Maybe not. Or maybe they did. A little. Enough. Because the history of medieval beauty is, at heart, a history of longing. Longing for grace, for gentleness, for a moment of feeling enough. And as the night deepens, you see yourself, not as a saint, not as a queen, but as part of that endless, hopeful crowd. Flawed, finished, real, whole. The standards were cruel, but the human spirit, clever, stubborn, quietly brave, always found a way to define beauty for itself. You turn over in your bed, eyes heavy, the village night quiet around you. The embers in your imaginary hearth glow warm and soft. The old wooden beams stretch like arms across the ceiling, whispering stories from long ago. You breathe in the hush. Let go of the old burdens, the sharp comparisons. It's the aching need to be anything but exactly what you are. Outside your window, the world rests too. The fields sigh beneath the stars. The forest hums. And far away, a single bell tolls goodnight. Somewhere, a river slips through the dark, unconcerned with perfection. And you, with your beautiful heart and your sleeping breath, are enough. Sleep well, traveler. Tomorrow will come, but tonight the world is gentle. And so are you.